Hello and welcome to Texas Bitcoin's Frontiers Roundtable discussion on theory of money and history of Bitcoin. I'm Daniel Krawitz, this is Michael Goldstein, and we have Pierre Rochard joining us today to talk about speculative attacks. Today the topic is hyperbitcoinization and speculative attacks. Shh, got some noise over there. So, well, the first thing that I want to say about this topic is this is mostly just a bunch of Bitcoiners, but some people have been complaining about how we invented the word hyperbitcoinization to describe a hypothetical future event in which a currency is completely defeated by Bitcoin. So I don't know what the problem is with that exactly, because I mean, if you want to have a new concept, you make up a new word for it, and that sort of happens all the time. And this is theoretically possible, so why wouldn't we want to talk about it?
Yeah, well, there was even that Bank of England report that used the term Bitcoinization, but they spelled it with an S because they're British.
Yes.
So it's not as cool. But we just added hyper because we believe that when it will occur very quickly.
Yeah. So another thing to say about a hyper Bitcoinization event. This is the end game for Bitcoin. This is where we think Bitcoin is going. Now, you know, we can't be sure of anything that happens in the future. You know, some people have criticized us for sounding very sure of ourselves, but what this really is this is the logic of our position. We're taking it to its logical conclusion, and if we're wrong, we have to lay out the case so that people understand it very well, and we'll be able to point out the errors in our reasoning. But it's just not necessary to say, oh, but maybe we're wrong after every sentence. So I wouldn't say that I am certain that hyper-Bitcoinization will happen, but it is the logic of my position.
Well, so I guess start off like explaining that logic of the position.
Oh,
so
yeah, that would be
over the course of these talks we've talked about what it is that why do people use money, and what value Bitcoin has. And we've also talked about things like Metcalfe's law and the value of networks, and how the value of networks actually increases exponentially. Every new node in a network increases the potential transactions or communications on the network exponentially. So this also translates into exponential changes in opportunity costs of choosing a particular network to be a part of. So as Bitcoin grows, the opportunity cost of not being in Bitcoin is increasing exponentially. And of course, this means that given there's no reason there should be a market cap below everyone, this exponential trend should just continue until it captures everyone.
Sure, and now one way of thinking a Bitcoin network grows, it becomes a more useful network.
Yeah.
Because you're more likely to meet people that have something you want to buy or want to buy something you want to sell. And simultaneously, the dollars network is shrinking. It hasn't shrunk very much yet, because Bitcoin is still relatively small. But at the same time as Bitcoin network is improving, the dollars network is getting worse. Not very much yet, but Bitcoin starts getting much bigger than it is now. There'll be a noticeable change.
Yeah, the competition is zero sum.
Yeah.
So people have had trouble with the understanding the network effects because they point to things like social networks, where, for instance, you can have an application that broadcasts to both Facebook and Twitter at the same time. So you don't necessarily have to decrease your usage in the sense of broadcasting a message, but with currency, you have to choose one. Like you can't have a token that's simultaneously a Bitcoin and a dollar.
Yeah. So, well, one thing that people sometimes ask is why are there so many currencies around today? When we're saying that there really should be only one in the end. Well, the answer is that the mini currencies world that we live in now is a relatively recent development. Until the mid 20th century, roughly, all currencies were just amounts of gold. So there really was only one currency and with different units of measurement, called the dollar and the franc and the pound and so on.
The dollar was literally 20th of an ounce of gold.
Right. So, and since we've gone off of the gold-backed model, we have fewer currencies. It's slow, but for example, there are more currencies that are just pegged to the dollar, which effectively
very much
makes
the same
dollars.
thing that what it was with gold.
And and then we also see developments like Europe moving to the euro, whereas before there were dozens of little currencies. And of course, that's not a market process, but it is a recognition that it is better to have one currency that everybody uses than to have all sorts of little tiny currency markets. So we are seeing that trend. It's slower than it should be because the various central banks around the world collude to prevent one currency from getting too strong. But they can't turn back the tide. They can only delay the process.
So I would actually argue that the dollar is in fact the one world currency today. When you look at the fact that oil is priced in the dollar and all other currencies fluctuations are seen in relation to the dollar, and the strength of a currency is largely defined by the exchange rate it has with the dollar. So in reality, it's almost as if the dollar itself is the one world currency, and then you have all these different denominations of it that freely float against it.
Yeah, that's true. Effectively, the dollar is dominant among all of the rest. So, so the thing about Bitcoin is that it is such a better currency than any of these other ones that people are flocking to it, even though, well, in the beginning it had no network, which is crazy, but people still got into it. And at each stage in its growth, we've consistently seen its network growing in value and providing new profit opportunities for people who want to use it. So, I mean, as I said before, I'm not certain that hyper-Bitcoinization will happen. I do feel fairly confident that Bitcoin will continue to grow from here. Now, maybe I could, if something happens and Bitcoin completely fails, I bet I could rationalize that in some way. But one thing that I could not explain at all, given everything that I know about the economics of money, is if Bitcoin just finds an equilibrium point with other currencies. That doesn't make any sense at all. And if and Bitcoin has no central bank to manipulate it and to collude with other central banks. So other currencies are helpless against it. So now why don't we go into the speculative attack topic. So Pierre, why don't you explain what that is? And
Sure. So I had known about currency speculative attacks before Bitcoin existed, but I'd never actually connected it to Bitcoin until a paper came out in April of 2013 by a law student actually at the University of Chicago titled "Regulating Digital Currencies: Bringing Bitcoin Within the Reach of the IMF." And it's a very odd title given that many Bitcoiners, including myself, are anarchists. And I'm not sure what the motives of the author were, if they were tongue-in-cheek or serious. But basically he explains that Bitcoin could destroy or threaten a fiat currency, and therefore the post-Bretton Woods institutions of the IMF and the U.S., which largely sponsors it, should prepare for this eventuality. And one of the proposed solutions is for the IMF to go and buy bitcoins, which I'm in full support of. But ultimately, I don't think that it would do much defense. Regardless,
could you explain what a speculative attack?
Yeah, right. So this paper actually doesn't provide a very good explanation of what speculative attacks are. So I had to go and read some source material and really flesh it out. Basically, a speculative attack is when you have the expectation that one currency is going to increase in value versus another currency. And with this expectation in mind, you borrow in the weakening currency. So in this instance, let's say there's a speculative attack on the dollar using bitcoins. So you would borrow dollars and purchase bitcoins. And then as the value of bitcoins goes up, as your expectation becomes fulfilled, then you sell the bitcoins or a fraction of the bitcoins and repay your dollar loan. So this process actually has the effect of weakening the dollar, because when you borrow in the dollar, you're actually, through fractional reserve banking, creating more dollars, and thus, in a self-fulfilling way, causing the dollar to weaken itself. And the only way to break such an attack is to increase the interest rate that you have to pay when you're borrowing to match the expected gain of owning bitcoins. So this means that in practical terms, if your expectation, and if the reality is that Bitcoin is going up tenfold every year, that means that the interest rate would have to be 1,000% for in US dollars to prevent a speculative attack from happening, or to stop one that's happening. And obviously that would cause so many problems that really I think that the government would just capitulate and give in to Bitcoin rather quickly.
So now, well, why don't you continue with what you were saying about the IMF paper thing?
Right. So the IMF has, as part of its mission, when there is a speculative attack on a currency, and so as I was saying earlier about the dollar being the dominant currency, when another currency decreases in value rapidly versus the dollar, this is essentially the process of that currency no longer being a part of the dollar hegemony and going out in the wilderness to die. So the IMF's mission is to prevent that from happening, because the process of a currency dying is a rather unpleasant one for the people who live in that country, regardless of what they think about their government or their central bank. So the IMF gets dollars from the Fed, gets euros from the EU, or actually from the countries that those central banks represent, and it helps backstop other countries by slowing down or trying to prevent the speculative attack from happening. And so they have to own the strong currency because that allows them to sell dollars and thus try to devalue dollars versus this local currency. So they would sell dollars for the local currency and try to prop it up. So to do this with bitcoins, they would have to sell bitcoins and buy the fiat currency to try to prop it up. So this solution really only works if there are other things going on at the same time, such as raising interest rates or reducing the government deficit so that they're running a surplus and so they can pay off debts and reforms like that, essentially. But with Bitcoin, I think that the end solution would be that the IMF would be selling Bitcoins and they would run out of Bitcoins to sell and it would be game over, except they just lost a bunch of money and they are holding worthless fiat. So really, I think that the solution he proposed isn't that great, but there isn't a great solution at all. Yeah.
Well, and the irony is that if you have to buy lots of bitcoins to prepare for a speculative attack, that's just strengthening Bitcoin.
Right. So you can cause a speculative attack by trying to prepare for one.
Yeah, and you know, so there are all kinds of ways that you can perform your own little speculative attack at home, right?
Should be like a PBS show.
Yeah.
We've seen this in the past. Sorry, how round is this roundtable?
Oh,
Did you have a question?
Yeah.
just come over so make sure we get it picked up.
Oh, here, okay. So back in the 90s, borrowing money was super cheap in Japan. I mean, they were giving money away, like loans away, at very, very low interest rates. And there was a comment by Warren Buffett that said that he didn't really see, because he was able to borrow at very low interest rates that the Japanese government was sending out, and he didn't really see any profitable businesses that he could invest in Japan. And so, going back to the speculative attack, would being able to borrow at basically 0% interest rates not be the same, have the same effect?
Well, you have to buy another currency in with the old currency, and then that would be a speculative attack. And yeah, so a currency with a very low interest rate. So of course now in Europe they've got negative interest rates, as I understand it, which so you can perform a speculative attack there and continue to get more money in interest, more of the weak currency in interest.
So Justice does bring up a good point. So what he seems to be describing is, so with Japan, for example, people would borrow in Japanese yen at a very low rate and then invest it somewhere else in the world, converting to that local currency, and then make money off the spread between those two rates, the rate at which they're borrowing and the rate at which they're investing. And that's called a carry trade. And really the reason, so traders since the 90s have been saying, oh, there's going to be a speculative attack on Japan, and have been, making bets that this would happen and constantly losing money because it's not happening. And there's a number of reasons why that's the case. The main one being that Japan runs a trade surplus, and that means that they have a large foreign exchange reserve with which they could defend themselves in the case of a speculative attack. And so a lot of the thing about speculative attacks is how much psychology is involved in your expectations, because you don't want to try to start a speculative attack and then have it fail. You'll lose lots of money. And this has happened repeatedly with Japan, with people trying to start a speculative attack and then failing. So I think that countries with a large trade surplus or with other structural advantages like that will be the last to fall to a speculative attack, like Japan, whereas countries with a huge trade deficit and big structural problems will be the first to fall. And there's a lot of candidates for that, so we'll see what happens with that. The other point I make in my post is that even for, let's take the most extreme example, which is Switzerland. Switzerland is, by any measure, the last imaginable country you would have a speculative attack in. And yet, with Bitcoin, if you were to start having these attacks in other countries, and the value of Bitcoin is going up, even in Swiss francs, then that creates an expectation among the Swiss that they should invest in Bitcoin rather than in their own currency, and thus that weakens the Swiss franc and strengthens Bitcoin and creates what's called reflexivity, where the change in the price of Bitcoins changes the fundamentals of the Swiss franc and thus causes a speculative attack, despite on day zero there being very good fundamentals for the Swiss franc. So that's why I think that the expectation of Bitcoin destroying every fiat currency is reasonable, despite there being very strong fiat currencies in existence today.
Have we seen speculative attacks like this in practice in history?
That's how George Soros made $1 billion in one day.
So right, and George Soros' attack was a mini one. I think though that because England was trying to, or the UK was trying to align with the euro or the future euro, if I remember correctly, and so they were trying to stabilize their exchange rate while also not having the policies that would allow for that. And George Soros bet that the Bank of England would not be able to defend the British pound, and ultimately won that bet and made lots of money by making such a bet. So that's the most recent, or one of the most well-known recent ones, just because of how much money George Soros made off of a first world country from doing that. There are lots of examples of countries that have had dollarization where they've replaced their local currency with the US dollar through a long series of speculative attacks. And I think one example is Ecuador in South America, and I'm not sure that they're still dollarized because obviously the government in a dollarized economy wants to get out of that situation so that they can go back to issuing too much money. And the other interesting question is, why has this not happened between fiat currencies and gold? Because you would obviously expect that gold, being a hypothetically better money than fiat, that you would have speculative attacks by borrowing fiat and buying gold. And this, in fact, has happened very recently. I would argue that the gold, quote-unquote, bubble in the late 70s, early 80s was a speculative attack on the dollar and was ultimately defeated by Paul Volcker by a very unusual monetary policy at the time, which was to target money supply instead of targeting the interest rate. And this caused the dollar interest rate to go up to the double digits. I think it reached a high of 27%. And that was enough to defeat the speculative attack on the dollar at the time. If he hadn't done so, I would imagine that the U.S. would have been in a very bad situation. So then one has to wonder, well, couldn't they do the same against Bitcoin? Couldn't they raise the interest rate to 27% and solve the problem? That's where I think we have to really look at the fundamental properties of Bitcoin versus gold. And I think that Bitcoin has many distinct advantages over gold, namely that in a digital era like ours, it would be very easy to switch software from the dollar or fiat currency to Bitcoins, whereas in 1980, it would have been very difficult to switch everything from the dollar to gold. And those lower transaction costs with Bitcoin and the lower switching costs make it such that it's much more challenging to prevent a speculative attack from a strong commodity-like currency like Bitcoin.
Okay, great. Do you have anything to add?
To that specific thing, no.
Anything that's been happening so far?
No.
Okay, then I will this topic, and we will move on to the final topic of the evening, which is the unit of account. So I wrote an article called "Bitcoin is the best unit of account," and well, I first want to tell the story of how I wrote it. So basically, I've been writing a series of articles on Bitcoin fallacies, and usually I have things where I say the opposite of what the man on the street is saying about Bitcoin. Oh, Bitcoin is too volatile. So I wrote an article called "I Love Bitcoin's Volatility." So for this one, people were complaining about Bitcoin being a bad unit of account because it's so volatile. So I wrote a title for an article, "Bitcoin is the best unit of account." And then I was like, well, how am I possibly going to argue this point? I thought back to an observation that Pierre had made a while back, that when you get into the Bitcoin mining business, you do all of your accounting in Bitcoins, because ultimately that's what matters. You want to be able to mine more Bitcoins than what you paid for them, and the exchange rate for Bitcoins in dollars over that period isn't relevant. So I just thought, well, a unit of account, that's just what you would use to separate a profit from a loss generally. And there isn't really anything that is a stable measure of value generally. I mean, in a static economy there would be, but in a general case there wouldn't be anything like that. There would just be something that you would use as a heuristic. And so if you really believe that Bitcoin is going to take over, then clearly Bitcoin is the best unit of account, because all that matters is having more Bitcoins at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And especially, well, I mean, it's easier to get them early on. And you don't, whether you have more dollars at the end of some action doesn't matter if the dollar is crashing. If everybody's running out of dollars, it's not really meaningful anymore. So it's kind of a change in how you it's a change in just how you look at the world, really. It's like a paradigm shift, a Copernican revolution, right? It's like that. It's like if you're a fish, you don't know there's water everywhere. It's like that, right? So yeah, Bitcoin is the best unit of account if you think that Bitcoin is going to be the future world's money. Then it only makes sense to to do your accounts in Bitcoin and differentiate profit from loss based on how many more Bitcoins you have now than before.
Yeah.
So I've been reading up on this issue in accounting, and they actually have this concept of a functional currency, which is what you're describing. Is you should use Bitcoin as your functional currency, and then the U.S. dollar would be a foreign currency to you. And then you had the reporting currency, which is what do you look at? Because to us, 1 Bitcoin is not meaningful because our purchases are done in dollars. Our purchases are done in a foreign currency. So our reporting currency should actually be in US dollars, while our functional currency is in Bitcoins. So it leads to it leads to odd situations. Sorry, what was that, Daniel?
What can you explain what a reporting currency? What does that mean?
Right. Okay. So let's say you've got your Bitcoin wallet, and then you got your dollar bank account. And let's say you've split your holdings into these two containers 50-50. And the value of Bitcoin goes up. I'm getting some feedback on the audio. The value of Bitcoin goes up. So your dollar holdings have gone down in value. And because Bitcoin is your virtual, or your functional currency. With dollars as your reporting currency, that means that you should see that loss in dollars. So let's say the Bitcoins goes up from $500 to $1,000. That means your Bitcoin holdings, or sorry, your dollar holdings have taken a 50% loss. Or rather, let's say you had $500 in your bank account, you would have $1,000 worth of Bitcoins had you invested in Bitcoins. So you have a $500 loss. So using dollars as your reporting currency, you would see that $500 loss. Using Bitcoins as your reporting currency, you actually you would see, let's say, 0.5 Bitcoin loss. And we're only used to actually using dollars both as the functional currency and the reporting currency, which makes it very counterintuitive when we change that around. Essentially, I would say another way of putting it would be you're using Bitcoins as your unit of account and dollars as your unit of measurement of purchasing power.
So sorry about that. There was some muffled voices coming in from the other room, so that's why the sound wasn't working for a sec.
Yeah, we have a question.
So, did this situation not exist for at least a brief period of time back when the U.S. was on a gold standard? Or at least loosely on the gold standard, where the everything was denominated in dollars but would be settled in gold. I seem to remember a movie about someone trying to corner the trade on gold, and it was throwing everyone's contracts into disarray because they needed to settle, and the price of the functional currency was skyrocketing because someone was trying to buy it all up. Do you know much about the U.S. gold history in respect to functional versus reporting currencies?
So I don't know about the U.S. specifically, but in terms of accounting, so I've been reading this accounting book by Luca Pacioli, which dates back to the 1400s, and in it he does mention that you need to convert all of the local currencies into one currency, i.e. the weight of gold, because he would have ducats and florins and all of these different currencies of the Renaissance era that to do your accounting and to be able to compare all these currencies, you have to convert them into the functional currency. Now, I guess in the U.S. you didn't really have that situation because, well, with one caveat, because of free banking, you would have different banknotes that had different values depending on the viability of the bank. So there you could have a difference, but I don't think that would introduce a difference in your functional versus reporting currency. I think that this is an extremely unique situation because you have a case where today's currency is different than what you expect tomorrow's currency to be. And I don't think that's ever existed in the history of humanity, where a large percentage of the population, or any percentage of the population, was like, okay, we're using this currency today. A few years from today, I expect to be using this different currency that's going to have a very different value than what it is today. I think that's unprecedented, and so it causes an unprecedented challenge in terms of accounting or even mental math of what value is.
Okay. I still do the $1,000 equals 1 Bitcoin conversion in my head.
Yeah. So, well, I guess. Well, now I want to talk about my two predictions for hyperbitcoinization. Because I forgot to mention them earlier, even though that was the main content of the hyperbitcoinization article. But so the difference between hyperbitcoinization and hyperinflation. This is kind of, you know, they're similar because they're both demonetized, because in hyperinflation, people are switching from a currency to not a currency, or to something worse than a currency. And in the late stages of hyperbitcoin or hyperinflation, people will buy anything because they know that their currency is going to be worthless very soon. So they're going out of currency and into whatever they can find, even if it may not have much of an exchange value. So hyperinflation totally destroys the division of labor and the ability to make indirect exchanges in a society. So whereas in a hyper-Bitcoinization event, we'll be moving from a worse currency to a better currency. So we will not see the same kind of economic disruption as before. I mean, it certainly would be disruptive, but the period of disruption will be over, you know, relatively quickly, and then there will immediately be tons of new opportunities for a greater division of labor because we're working with a better currency that provides people with better options. And that was one of my predictions. Do you remember what the other one was? Otherwise, I'll have to find it.
I don't remember them simply by number.
Okay, well, keep talking about it while
So my prediction would be that we'll have a golden age of sorts. I'm getting feedback again where I can hear my voice. We'll have another period of a golden age of sorts, because one of the main things that cheap money does is it distorts people's understanding and appreciation for the value of saving and investing. And I think that Bitcoin will bring back a sense of thrift and a desire to make good long-term investments, which fundamentally is much better for the economy and much better for the culture too. So that's my prediction. Is it won't cause a dark age like what Keynesians or pessimists may believe, but rather a period of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity.
Yeah, I agree totally. And so I I looked up my other prediction, and it is that hyperbitcoinization will be faster than hyperinflation for the same reason that I gave before, that since we're moving from something worse to something better,
You want to make it happen.
people will want to do it. Whereas if your choice is to keep a rapidly inflating currency or to go into something that's not a currency at all, well, that's not a very good choice. People are going to resist that until they can't anymore.
Hyperinflation is an aspect of fear, though, not an aspect of greed.
Well, I mean, it depends on who you are. Like if you are one of the first people to figure out that hyperinflation is going to happen, then you can get greedy and prepare for it by going into hard assets like gold and silver. And it's really the same with Bitcoin. The early adopters are greedy, but when we get to a point where half the world has Bitcoin and the other half are trying to get it, then then it's at least as much about fear as greed, because this other half is going to be worried that whatever currencies they are holding aren't going to buy anything for very long.
All right, well, on that note, I have to leave the podcast. I've got to go eat dinner.
All right, good night. Thanks for joining us.
Good night. Bye.
Good night. Bye. Bye.
So I think that goes through all of our topics.
Yep.
Do we have any questions?
I have a comment to make
Please.
about your about the concept of a dark age.
Yeah.
It really depends on who you are. For the people who benefit, who basically just get to live for free, a world where they can't do that is a dark age for them.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think they'll probably.
Again, it depends on your perspective.
I mean, if there's a sudden period of unprecedented economic growth, I think they'll probably get into the spirit of things eventually.
They could get over it pretty quickly, hopefully.
They may have to get a real job, but you know.
That's a huge blow.
Yeah.
To, like, I mean, there are hereditary families where, like, you've got, I don't know, uncounted generations where no one has had a real job because they just worked politics and aristocracy back before it was politics.
Yeah.
If people are not going to get over it quickly. But
Sucks
they're
for them.
such a tiny minority. But they're a tiny minority with all the political power. So
Yeah.
you don't want to forget them when we say that yes, it would be a golden age for the other 99% of us. That's true. But that doesn't mean that the people who are going to have to get real jobs are going to take it lightly.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I think that they'll be buying bitcoins in droves pretty soon.
And then they can be
That-
Bitcoin rich and
that
not have to have
class.
a real job.
Because I mean, they may well be smart enough to see the writing on the wall before most people.
Yeah.
Hopefully they're too complacent for that.
Yeah.
Perhaps defection can be a later topic for a podcast.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining us.
Buy Bitcoins.
Yeah.